Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Shireen, and I'll be moderating today's book launch event, which features the authors of a new book out at Haymarket Books, China in Global Capitalism, Building International Solidarity Against Imperial Rivalry. From trade wars and pandemic politics to rioting workers and battles over TikTok, the US media tends to present contemporary China in sensationalist terms. This portrayal has only intensified as China's relationship with the US has grown increasingly hostile. Whether in the form of overtly racist rhetoric and aggressive trade actions, or the more buttoned down but equally antagonistic efforts to oppose Chinese interests abroad, the US has made clear that it has no interest in giving up its position as global hegemon. China and global capitalism makes the case that workers and socially marginalized people in both the US and China must oppose their rulers' claims that they have our best interests in mind as they ratchet up their rivalry and instead must oppose imperialism in all its forms. Today's speakers include the co-authors of the book, Kevin Lin, an activist and researcher on China's labor movement. Kevin Lin has been engaged in building international labor solidarity. He's currently a visiting fellow at Cornell University and is working on a book project about worker struggles in China. Eli Friedman teaches in the Department of Global Labor and Work at Cornell University. His most recent book is The Urbanization of People, Development, Labor Markets, and Schooling in the Chinese City. Ashley Smith is a socialist writer and activist in Burlington, Vermont. He's written in numerous publications, including Truth Out, the International Socialist Review, Socialist Worker, Jacobin, New Politics, Against the Current, Tempest, and other online and print publications. Additionally, the other co-author of the book, who was not able to make it today, is Rosa Liu, a former NGO worker from China who now lives in Canada. She's been researching and writing about gender and environmental politics in China for over a decade. So I'll be asking the authors questions about their book for about an hour before we turn it over to audience questions. So I'll start with a question to all of you. Why did you decide to write this book, and what were your goals? You can start with Kevin.
Sure. Thank you so much for this event. I think maybe one way to think about this book project is it comes out of collaboration between all of the co-authors here today over a period of 4 years. We started to organize a conference back in early 2020, just before the pandemic, and that continued with other projects that we worked together. But I think for me, the interest in writing a book like this together was my realization over a period of a number of years about the lack of understanding or sometimes lack of interest in China on the U.S. left. I think there is very often a sense that, even though I think U.S. and China conflict is going to be the defining conflict in the coming decades, very often I find the leftists in the U.S. are either kind of uninterested or feel they do not know enough about China to really say much about it. So we thought, well, why don't we write a book about China that is easy to understand? So we write in a way that is not for China experts. Why don't we write a book for the U.S. left? And that here's the product of almost 4 years of collaboration.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And just to build on it a little bit, we wrote first and foremost thinking about the U.S. left. We are based in the U.S., but we think that there's relevance for people in many places around the world. We've all spent time in various places in East Asia and Western Europe in particular. And as Kevin said, one of the basic understandings in the book is that this US-China conflict is going to be probably the defining geopolitical fact of the next several decades, even though it might not feel like it right at the moment when you have some other places that are a bit more on fire. And so one of the consequences of that is that we can't just leave it to Americans and Chinese people to deal with this, that there are consequences of the way this conflict plays out for people in every corner of the world, right? Whether it's Europe, which we saw just yesterday announced new tariffs on European electric vehicles, or whether it's in the DRC where the cobalt that is being mined is ending up in those electric vehicles, and the U.S. and China are kind of fighting over the control of those kinds of supply chains. So again, we wrote it in English. We're mostly the kind of the social movement communities that we're embedded in are mostly in the U.S., but we do think that there's broader relevance.
I'll just add to what Kevin and Eli said, is that my biggest concern in collaborating with them and Rosa on the book is helping the left overcome on what I would say is an inadequate understanding both of China and the nature of global capitalism and the characteristics of the rivalry between the US and China. Many people on the left have a kind of outmoded framework of just unipolar US dominance of the world system. That is, there's only the US in charge of everything and it's behind everything, which seemed descriptive of things in the post-Cold War period, maybe up until the early 2000s, but a several combination of developments have produced a whole new geopolitical and geoeconomic situation, and with that military dynamics that have outmoded that old unipolar order. So now we do have a return of interstate rivalries at every level of the system between especially the US and China, but also the US and Russia, as well as regional interstate rivalries of an intense character that's combined with big uprisings from below in almost every state around the world. And it poses the question for the international left: how do we oppose the US and its rival imperialisms and all the different capitalist states and stand in solidarity with the movements from below without exception? And I think China and the US rival really poses that question in a sharp fashion. So one of the big motivations was to give people an understanding that there's an alternative to siding with either of these states. And the alternative is to build solidarity between the social and class movements of each country against the rivalry and for a whole different kind of order that will put people before profit.
So Eli, you make a case that China is capitalist today, which I think is certainly not automatic or the broad understanding of much of the left, at least in the US. So why is that the case, and how has China transformed since the 1970s?
Yeah, it's I actually wrote an article for Spectre about this. I guess it was 4 years ago, which Ashley kind of prodded me into doing, and I was a little reluctant because I think for people who have spent a lot of time living in China, or particularly for leftists who've spent time living and working in China, it kind of seems like a non-issue, right? You go to China and people intuitively understand it as being part of global capitalism. But I understand that it is not intuitive. And one of the reasons that it's not intuitive, which is really important to acknowledge at the outset, is that it is still controlled by the Communist Party that refers to its system as socialist, right? But part of what we're doing here is trying to encourage people to approach the statements of the Chinese state with the same kind of level of critical engagement that you might engage with the United States when, for instance, Joe Biden says we are a democracy. So the fact that Joe Biden says America is a democracy is relevant for understanding politics in the United States, but that doesn't mean that you say, oh, well, it's democratic, right? The same way when Xi Jinping says China is a socialist state, I think we should approach that skeptically and try to understand exactly what's going on. So there's a couple of reasons why we think of China as being capitalist. And the first way that we talk about this is basically the way that Marx talks about it, right? If you look at the way he writes capital, he begins with a commodity. And so the question is, how are things being produced? Are they being produced as commodities or not? And if we look at contemporary China, we can see that production is being organized around the commodity form, right? And this doesn't matter if we're talking about basic human necessities, food, medicine and medical equipment. Housing critically in China is produced as a commodity. That is the case, right? So production is organized around the production of commodities. You can also approach it from the perspective of people, right? And so asking the question, everyone's born into a society, how do they go about surviving? Well, in China, people go about surviving the same way that they do in the United States or France or Brazil or other countries that we all understand to be capitalist, which is to say the overwhelming majority of people have to sell their labor power in order to survive. The only property that they have is their own labor power. They go out, they get a job, they get wages in exchange, and then they take those wages to buy the things that they need in order to be able to reproduce themselves. So I've already said that housing is a commodity. You need money in order to buy housing. Healthcare is not provided as a right? So the healthcare system is a little bit complicated, but you talk to Chinese people, everybody understands they need to save money in order to pay for all kinds of health expenses. And all of the other things that one needs to survive, those things have to be purchased on the market, right? So that is a proletarian situation. And what follows from that is that China has a class structure that looks very similar to just about any other society that you might characterize as capitalist, where you have the overwhelming majority of people, again, who are working class. They have to depend on selling their labor in order to survive. And you have a much smaller percentage of people that own some kind of productive property, and they can live off the profits of that. There's a couple of things, a couple of other points that I think can lead to some confusion around China being socialist versus capitalist, in addition to the fact that the state says it is socialist. So one of those is that you still have a relatively large percentage of the economy that is in the state sector, right? So somewhere between 25% to 30% of the economy is still in the state sector, which is certainly higher than the United States. It's higher than countries in Western Europe today. It is not crazy historically to see capitalist societies that have a similar sort of a percentage. So if you look at the peak of France in the post-war period, it was kind of similar. If you look at Taiwan, China's old enemy, in the 1980s, about 25% of its economy was in the state-owned sector. It does create some sort of different dynamics. But if you look at the organization of China's state-owned enterprises, they are oriented, they are disciplined by the market, and they are oriented towards the generation of profit, right? And that's really important. And again, they are a minority of the economy. So China also has big private enterprises, like the ByteDance, the owner of TikTok, I think is a famous one, BYD, which is now the world's largest manufacturer of electric vehicles. Those are fully private corporations. It's really important to understand that even those SOEs are oriented towards profit, because what we see is the way that the state is behaving, both domestically and internationally, is in the interest of the accumulation of wealth for those corporations. And this is the thing that really brings it into conflict with the United States, which we'll get more into, I think, in a moment. But the fact ultimately that they are nominally owned by the state doesn't actually affect that behavior, right? That they're out there trying to extract profits, including from their own workforce. And critically, and there's lots of debates about how to think about socialism, even if they are owned by the state, the workers themselves don't actually exercise any kind of democratic governance over those firms, and that's quite clear. These are dictatorial organizations. So for all of those reasons, we think about China as capitalist. And this is not just an academic exercise to sort of say, well, we can categorize this country as one thing and this country as another thing. It's really important. The reason that we start the book with this chapter is because this understanding of China as capitalist first allows us to understand what's behind this interstate conflict between the US and China. It's actually not an ideological conflict between freedom and democracy on one side and socialism and whatever on the other. No, it's actually around trying to capture opportunities for profits within the world system. That's the first point. And the second point, when we get to the question of social struggles, we can see that the social struggles in China are also driven in large part, although not exclusively, in large part by this logic of capitalism, which means that there is a material basis for solidarity across these different kinds of countries.
Yeah, I think that's another aspect that the left could do better at, analyzing the internal class dynamics in other states in order to understand how to classify those states, as you're alluding to. So on that vein, what impact has China's capitalist development had on different classes and groups in Chinese society, and what kind of class and social struggles has the transformation of Chinese society generated? And I'll direct that at Eli and Kevin.
Kevin, why don't you go first, and I'll follow.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, and I just want to also echo what Eli was saying. I should just quickly add, I think there used to be a serious debate about the nature of Chinese system, especially about the Mao period on the left, that I think it's quite important debate. And there was also important discussion debate around the nature of China's transition in the 1980s and into the 1990s. But by pretty much by early to mid 1990s, there was very clear China was going to, whatever Mao period was, China was going to a capitalist direction by the 1990s, certainly. So for most of the last 20 years, I hardly see, at least my reading of the left globally, so there's hardly any serious debate about the nature of Chinese society until a few years ago, where there are again questions about, oh, maybe China is socialist or at least non-capitalist. And I think it's sort of interesting to observe why is this again becoming a question after not being a question for maybe over 2 decades. And I think one big reason is the intensification of U.S.-China conflicts, and a lot of people on the left globally, not just here in the U.S. but also in parts of Europe, because they see, oh, now the China is U.S. Number one or number two enemies, therefore it must be something different. And I think that's definitely not the case, as Eli was illustrating. To your question, I think both Eli and I have been researching labor in China, and we, or at least I see the transformation of Chinese society certainly through the links of the working class, and certainly back again in the 80s and 90s, that's when at first Chinese government introduced capitalist labor relations in certain pockets called special economic zones, and by the 2000s kind of generalized more or less across the whole country. And we see this huge transformation of labor relations in China. Workers, their conditions were becoming precarious. The level of exploitation was extremely high, but we also see massive labor resistance, which we talk about in the book, in the chapter on labor, certainly from the 2000s onwards. And we really see labor as a key kind of dimension or perspective in understanding Chinese society and transformation of Chinese society, because you both see the commodification of labor over the 80s and 90s, and then you also see the massive resistance of workers driving social change. And for many years, we really see that labor was certainly not just passive sort of recipients of exploitation, but they were actually changing their condition. They were improving their conditions, raising their own wages, and overall, making them a important social force to contend. So I think that's one thing that we look at in some details in one of the chapters, because we want to see the internal class dynamic. Again, to emphasize that, we kind of purposefully not want to only focus on U.S.-China conflict per se, because I think that sometimes give us a sort of state-centric framing or understanding. We want to look at the internal class dynamics, how class relations change, and also how workers and peasants and women and other social groups are actually changing, and China is now static. And I think over the last few years, because of the rising authoritarianism within China, we do not hear as much about the kind of internal social dynamics, internal social changes in China. And so in this book, we actually try to highlight that Chinese society was never static, and certainly was not static in the last 20, 30 years. And we see that with regard to workers, peasants, et cetera.
If I could add just a little bit to this. So if you look at the process of China's transition to capitalism over the last 40 years, in some ways it looks quite similar to the classic process of capitalist development, where you have this proletarianization, you have an overwhelmingly agricultural population, people moving to the cities, getting jobs in factories and menial service sector, and the process of capital accumulation, right? So it's different from Western countries, but in a lot of ways looks pretty similar to what happened elsewhere in East Asia, be it Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. One of the important differences, though, is that China was socialist first. And so in contrast to what happened in those other countries, what you saw in China in the 1980s is that you have a country that is pretty poor in terms of GDP output, but has relatively good human development, right? Literacy, investments in health, et cetera, and is quite equal. And China goes from being a very equal country in the mid-1980s to being, it's kind of like Nordic levels of equality, to being one of the most unequal countries in the world, measured by Gini coefficient, by the 21st century, especially by, let's say, by 2008 or so, right? So just a really astronomical, like very, very, very quick increase in inequality in a short period of time. And that was very different. So in Taiwan, for instance, the period of rapid economic development actually reduced inequality. And so I think that that's really significant for understanding the kind of the social dynamics and what people have experienced there in recent decades. One thing that we hear a lot is that China has lifted 600 million people or 800 million people out of poverty or whatever it is. It's important, and I don't want to undermine the significance of what has happened there over the last 40 years. It is very impressive, and just about everybody, their life is materially better than it would have been 40 years ago. That being said, it's also really important to keep in mind that when people are citing that, they're using the World Bank definition of living on, $1.90 or less per day. And so what you see in the 1980s and 1990s especially is you see the destruction of the non-marketized forms of social reproduction, access to free housing, free healthcare, the emergence of a labor market that then pays people. And it's, yes, people's wages have gone up. They're now making more money than they were in the 1980s, but they don't have to pay for their housing and their healthcare, right? So if we look at it in sort of relative terms, I think that transition from a poor kind of socialist kind of economy to a much richer capitalist economy is not in kind of social terms the miracle that it sometimes seems to be when you're looking at in terms of GDP production.
So, Eli, you also point out that China now oppresses nations and national minorities within its territory, while also threatening other nation states abroad. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll allow Ashley to say something about the international stuff. But in terms of the nationalities question within China, this is one of the most contentious issues, I think, within China and internationally. It's also very complicated, so I can only talk about it pretty briefly, right? But what we look at in the book is 4 key areas where similar sorts of problems have emerged: Tibet, Xinjiang, or the Uyghur region in northwestern China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. These are different for different regions for different reasons, because we have different ethnic dynamics, different levels of economic development, etc. But the one thing that we talk about as uniting the conflicts, the first thing that unites them all is that there has been intense conflict, especially since 2008. In Tibet, the conflict goes back longer, where in contrast to the Han-dominated core of China, we've seen kind of overt anti-state mobilization, clashes with the police and with military. That's been true in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong. And then in the case of Taiwan, of course, we see increased possibility of direct military confrontation. And Taiwan is complicated and confusing for different reasons, because it has de facto sovereignty and the other places do not. But one of the fact that there is a kind of imperial center that is trying to control its periphery, this is not a thing that is unique to the PRC. It's important to note that there's a long imperial history, the Ming Dynasty, but especially in the Qing Dynasty, which was the dynasty that preceded the Republic of China, which preceded the People's Republic of China, of expansion, right? Well, how did China get to be so big? Clearly, there was imperial expansion that was going on. So this is not necessarily something new. The fact that China is capitalist now does have important implications for understanding how non-Han people are being incorporated into this polity. And the essential problem that we've identified is that you have this effort to kind of control these peripheries, right? Through expansion of infrastructure, building of railways, through natural resource extraction, through investments of corporations, both private and state. But what we see, and this is clearest in Tibet and Xinjiang, but to some extent also in Hong Kong and Taiwan, is that deeper economic integration with China's core has overwhelmingly not benefited local people, but in fact has benefited Han people who have moved out from the core into these peripheral areas. So if we look at Tibet, if we look at Xinjiang, we see that yes, the state has made a lot of investment. Yes, GDP growth has grown, but it is a pretty normal kind of a colonial situation where you have the kind of the racialized indigenous people in those communities. They are being dispossessed. They are not getting the mining contracts. They are by and large not getting even the state sector jobs that would provide them better protections. And the benefits from this new economic integration overwhelmingly is going to Han owned corporations. And so all of this investment has actually led to greater racialized forms of economic inequality in those places. And the sense of pride that many Chinese people, I think, rightly feel about their country becoming stronger, richer, can't be pushed around by imperialists anymore, right? Those are all good things that I think that Han people should feel a sense of pride for. But that kind of sense of national pride doesn't resonate for Uyghur people, who, in fact, their primary point of reference is not the fact that Japan or Great Britain had colonized China in the 19th and early 20th century, which was the case, but that they are currently being colonized by Han people, that their children are being put into boarding schools, that they're being put into internment camps, that they're not being allowed to practice their religion or speak their language. And so that creates a much more intense kind of social conflict in those peripheral areas than is the case for the kinds of the social class within the Han ethnicity that Kevin was just referring to, among workers, among peasants, right? Which there's a lot of conflict there, there's a lot of mobilization as well, but it doesn't have the same kind of intensity and violent nature as it does elsewhere. Hong Kong and Taiwan are different and much more complicated issue, and I think we'll probably have something to say about Taiwan in particular when it comes to the U.S. conflict, because that is probably the most likely flashpoint for conflict. But Ashley, I don't know if you want to say something more about the interstate conflict with China.
Well, I'll pose a question to Ashley directly. So Ashley, the U.S. is clearly the world's dominant imperialist power, but you make the argument that China is now an imperial power in its own right. Why is that the case, and what are the features of China as a new great power?
Yeah, I think you first have to begin with clarity about what imperialism is, because I think for a lot of people, imperialism gets defined as a characteristic of a particular state or country, instead of, as Marxists or people on the left, we should have an understanding of imperialism as actually a product of capitalism, that it's a result of the nature of capitalist competition between economic corporations globally, and the rulers of those economic corporations, those elites that control them, the bosses, to put it crudely, they use their home state to project their power interests in the world in pursuit of profit, resources, market share, investment sites. The problem under capitalism is all the capitalist nation states are doing the same thing, which leads to a collision between capitalist nation states. And I think this has been true from the dawn of capitalism, from the conflict between the Netherlands and England for the early division of the developing capitalist system, all the way to today between China and the US. Now, the conflicts are unstable, and they don't produce permanent hierarchies. That is the kind of logic of development and competition, the crises of the system, the conflicts between states, sometimes the wars, upset the interstate system and reorder it. So you get an unstable hierarchy of the dominant powers middling powers, or you could call them sub-imperial powers, and oppressed nations and oppressed peoples within the states. So I think China is really subject to that logic of competition, and it has grown up within a state system that has been superintended, especially since the 1990s when the U.S. was an unrivaled power. It has grown up first in cooperation with the United States and increasingly in competition, not only with the United States, but also Japan and Europe as it jumps up the value chain of global capitalist production, so that the transformations that Eli and Kevin were talking about externally, you can see happening externally, so that China has now transformed itself into the world's second largest economy. It is one of the largest international investors in the world. Just think of the Belt and Road Initiative, which has $1 trillion of investment globally for infrastructure development. And it has become a big recipient of foreign direct investment because of its productive development on a global scale. But this didn't happen all at once. Initially, China was really an export processing platform for a lot of multinational corporations. But the Chinese state, its ruling class, from the very beginning was intent on preserving a section of state-owned industry as it got rid of the uncompetitive ones, so that it could control its internal and external economy. And then it required the multinationals to pair with Chinese corporations, both private and state-owned, to transfer technology, with the aim from the very beginning of China leaping up the value chain and becoming competitive. And so it's gone as a result of that process from being a marginal player in the world economy in the 1970s to one of the central powers, economic powers. And that's now produced a situation where both its state and private corporations really rival European capital, Japanese capital, and U.S. capital. Just think of BYD, as Eli was saying, which is the leading electric vehicle manufacturer in the world, and there are many other examples. Huawei, which is a huge telecommunications company and producer of mobile phones, which is increasingly competitive on a global scale. And there are endless examples of both state and private corporations like that. That has turned China into a big capitalist power, the second most powerful economy in the world. And that has driven it to seek out new markets, secure resources, sites for investment. That's what's generated the export of capital through the Belt and Road Initiative, with huge infrastructure development plan, which is in the interests of Chinese capitalism, often infrastructure that's designed in a very extractivist way to set up mining operations for key resources that then get transported back to the Chinese economy. So it's developed in a classic imperialist fashion relative to the global South for key minerals and other things. That massive exertion of power has brought it into geopolitical competition with the United States. As that it grows in size economically, it wants to ensure it has a network of alliances. And so it's built an alliance with Russia, but as well as other countries in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's also initiated an alliance of other middling powers in the world economy, the BRICS bloc that it is using to assert its geopolitical interests globally. And to enforce that, it's modernized and transformed its military. So now it has the second largest military budget in the world, dwarfed, of course, by the giant military budget of the United States, which is over double what China spends on its military. But nonetheless, China has used that military to project its interests in the near abroad, especially in the Asia Pacific, setting up military bases in the island chains around China and the South China Sea, squabbling with other nations in the region over access to fisheries, trade routes, undersea oil and natural gas reserves, and to assert its power against the U.S., which is the hegemonic military power in Asia. So all of this is generating inter-imperial rivalry between these two biggest economies of the world, the United States and China, and it's rippling through every part of the world system. No part of the world, like Eli was pointing to, in Europe is free from this competition. That the Biden administration pushed for the European Union to put these tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. That is, the whole world is being subordinated to this conflict. And the biggest flashpoint is over Taiwan, which is, I'll talk about later, I think is the key flashpoint around which scary things could develop in the coming years.
So Ashley, could you talk a little bit about how the U.S. has responded to China's rise as a new great power, and what's the character of the rivalry between the U.S. and China, and what the flashpoints are of this rivalry internationally? And before you start, I just want to encourage people who are listening to write their questions in the chat, because in a few minutes we'll switch over to audience questions. But go ahead.
Yeah. I think the first thing to say is we have to underscore that the U.S. remains the dominant imperialist power in the world, the biggest economy, biggest military, biggest network of alliances like NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and also the biggest empire of bases. Like, it's got 800 military bases around the world. So you're talking about a modern day Rome that the U.S. carved out after the end of the Cold War that was really unrivaled and without any challenge from any state, capitalist state in the world system. But that has been undone by three big developments. One, the long neoliberal boom, which transformed China into a huge center of capital accumulation in the world, and, as I said, into the second largest economy. The other thing was the U.S. attempt to lock in its dominance through military exertions of power, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the whole Middle East blew up in its face, in which it suffered humiliating defeats in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And the third development is the 2008 global financial crisis and the long recession that has ushered in a period that some people call a global slump. That has hammered the U.S. economy in particular, while China continued to boom. Even as it has slowed, it's continued to expand much faster than the United States. So all these developments led to the relative decline of the U.S. as an imperial power. But as I said, it still remains the dominant one. But with these developments, the U.S. over the last 15, 20 years has really begun to change its policy towards China, as it has shifted from seeing it as something that it could incorporate into a U.S. superintended global capitalism, into a rival that was threatening its dominance. And so you can see over the last three administrations in particular, a real shift away from what some people call congagement, which was the previous policy of a combination of containment and engagement with China, to increasingly a containment policy. So we had Barack Obama's pivot to Asia, famously, in which he wanted to incorporate all of Asia under U.S. terms, neoliberal terms, with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. He wanted to rebuild the alliance structures, especially in Asia, against China, and divert most of the military, U.S. military, 60% of its Navy, to the Asia Pacific. That failed. He didn't get the TPP. He got preoccupied with the endless wars in the Middle East and the uprisings against the autocracies in the region, and he therefore failed to really carry out the pivot. Trump followed up with his own kind of erratic nationalism against China, targeting China very specifically, calling the U.S. new policy great power rivalry, specifically against China and Russia. Those were the two named things in his national security documents. And his nationalism included all the protectionist tariffs, but Trump was so erratic and unpredictable that he didn't really implement a reliable strategy. And a lot of it was a contradiction at the heart of Trump's policy, and because it was unclear whether he wanted to really impose protectionism, or did he want to bully China into opening up its markets for U.S. multinationals? So there was a confusion and contradiction at the heart of Trump's policy. And I'll just end by talking about what Biden has done, because I think he has the most coherent policy so far, which is essentially what I've called imperialist Keynesianism. Rebuild American industrial strength through industrial policy at home, especially in high tech, chips manufacturing, solar industry, etc., while refurbishing a network of alliances that Trump had torn apart to confront what they call the autocracies, China and Russia, continuing the great power rivalry, and then implement a strategy of what they call de-risking. That is not full decoupling, but a protectionist policy towards China in particular areas: chips, high tech, solar industry. He's just done massive tariffs on electric vehicles, which are not even in the United States from China yet, but it's a defensive preemption of what China does, because China is actually more advanced in electrical vehicle production than the U.S. corporations. So the U.S. has responded to the challenge from China with an increasingly containment policy, competition, and especially they have escalated the militarization of the relations in Asia towards China, building and expanding the military alliances with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, to encircle China and challenge China's assertion in the Asia Pacific. And all of this, I think, is producing flashpoints of conflict. Number one, around economics, especially over high-tech industry. Number two, around geopolitical competition for allies in the global south. And then, most importantly, the military competition in the Asia Pacific, specifically around Taiwan, which is so strategically important because it produces 90% of the world's most advanced chips, which are essential for not only corporations, but also for military hardware. The F-35 can't fly without these advanced microchips. And so Taiwan is a huge prize for global capitalism. And that explains the conflict between the US and China over Taiwan, in which China wants to reassert its and incorporate Taiwan, which it considers a renegade province, while the U.S. wants to use Taiwan as a pawn in its geopolitical competition with China. And lost amidst this is the self-determination of the Taiwanese people, which neither power takes seriously and which we should all support. So we have a huge rivalry that's developing that has economic, military, and geopolitical features, and it is going to be the central inter-imperial conflict of the 21st century.
Thank you. Kevin, how does this U.S.-China rivalry prevent coherent responses to pressing global issues like climate change and controlling the outbreak of pandemics?
Yeah, thanks. I also want to just quickly add that Eli mentioned in passing about Hong Kong. Actually, it's also one of the reasons why we collaborated and wrote this book on the back of the protests in Hong Kong in 2019. Obviously, it was months of very militant struggles in Hong Kong against a specific extradition bill. But it was also broadly about the future of Hong Kong for many of the city's residents. The reason I mentioned this is it created a lot of confusion on the U.S. left. Certainly, I remember I was here in 2019, and it was quite disorienting. moment where many on the left would argue that because the right wing here in the U.S. Is supporting the Hong Kong protesters, therefore they must be reactionary or not worth of support on the left. Obviously, any broad movement has different elements, and there are right-wing elements in the Hong Kong movement. But broadly, it was, I think, a democratic movement. But I think what was important for me was the kind of confusion and sometimes I think lack of concern for people actually on the ground. For people on the ground, it was not an abstract debate or it wasn't a political point to score. And of course, in the last few years, there has been a huge wave of crackdown still ongoing in Hong Kong on dissent. And I used to say, like, I think Hong Kong was the first casualty of U.S.-China conflict. Back to your question, I think the rivalry that Eli and Ashley highlighted between U.S.-China is really hampering any possibility of collaboration on climate change. In the book, we have 2 chapters, 1 chapter on climate change and 1 chapter on the pandemic. I would just quickly say something about climate, because again, historically, Europe and the US has been responsible for most of the CO2 emissions, but China in the last few decades has been catching up in terms of its own emission because it has been industrializing rapidly. Although I should say, that's partly, in large part, a result of industrial production moving to China, therefore producing pollutions. But the point that we are trying to make in the book is that for the climate crisis, we cannot rely on either state. I think overall, actually, the Chinese state is actually better. At least it doesn't deny the man-made climate crisis, like in other parts of the world. But still, it's continued to generate pollutions, and I don't think. I think the same kind of capitalist logic applies in terms of environmental pollution, destruction, and climate crisis in China. And what this means is that we do not think that that climate crisis can be resolved by either the Chinese state or the U.S. state. We would definitely like to see collaboration to the extent it exists, although we have not seen a lot of that over the last decade or so. But we also think it's a question that we have to deal with through popular mobilizations in both countries and elsewhere, and there again we try to move away from a state-centric view of or solution and try to look at the possibility of popular organizing and mobilization to address climate crisis. And because now China and US are the top polluting countries in the world in terms of CO2 emissions, without radical change in both countries and again elsewhere, we are going to be in a really bad place in terms of the impact of climate crisis.
I'll just add to what Kevin said that the 2 states are actually an impediment to addressing the climate change. If you look at especially what the U.S. is doing, it's raising tariffs and putting restrictions on the trade from China of extremely affordable electric vehicles, which would help with a green transition in the United States. But because of the economic and geopolitical competition between the U.S. and China, the U.S. doesn't want those entering and competing with its domestic auto manufacturers, and it's afraid of the national security implications for having Chinese electric vehicles in the United States. And it's bullied the European Union to do the same thing. So U.S. economic and geopolitical policy is actually preventing the green transition away from oil-based automobiles, fossil fuel-based automobiles to electric vehicles. And I think it's important to say that the Chinese green capitalism is extractivist at its core. That is, it's based on the huge export and extraction of minerals from the global south to that are essential for the electric vehicle manufacturing. So there's a real problem there as well, and it's paired with, in China, continuing use of coal, oil, and natural gas, which are driving up CO2 emissions as it makes the green transition. So there are contradictions all over what's going on with climate change that are a result of capitalist competition and imperial rivalry. And the same can be said about all the pandemic crises that we went through with COVID.
I'll just ask two more questions and then we'll get to we have some great audience questions. So Kevin, could you talk a little bit about how the US has whipped up increasing xenophobia as part of its rivalry, and what impact this has had on Chinese immigrants, students, Chinese Americans, and Asian Americans more broadly?
Absolutely. Obviously, there's a history of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism in the U.S. going all the way back to the 19th centuries. And it certainly did not start with the COVID pandemic. It got much worse. We heard stories of how people fear to even go out because they are, even they may not even be Chinese, they're probably Asian that look like or Chinese people in the U.S. And I think that certainly escalated during COVID. I also think even I would argue that even without some of the hateful rhetoric, the anti-Asian racism under Biden, we see the continuing building up of militarization in the Asia Pacific region, for example, and policies here in the U.S. that target scholars, target students, and other Chinese people. So sometimes those racism or anti-Chinese or anti-Chinese racism comes with very hateful rhetoric. Other times, I think the rivalry, the imperial rivalry that actually has sort of sketched out, can also continue without, under very kind of liberal, under the Democrats, liberal government, that can continue. So I think we should be on guard both on very hateful, very explicit anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism, but also even sometimes in the absence of that we should not overlook the continuing escalation of rivalry. But also in the book, we highlighted two other things that we think are really important. One is the history of Asian American radicalism. That sometimes get forgotten in discussion of Asian Americans. Actually, we talk about in the book Asian American. This idea of Asian American is not just a racial category. It was actually a political project that came out of 1960s and 70s radicalism, where Asian Americans organized along with other revolutionaries, the Black Panthers and others, to counter imperialism, colonialism in Asia, and as well as racism in the US and capitalism. So I think we want to recover that history because that's really important history. But we also try to connect that with what's happening in the last couple of years, which is the politicization and radicalization of a lot of Chinese international students here in the US who have been radicalized by the COVID restrictions, some of the harsh restrictions and authoritarianism in China, and began to engage in a variety of activism, including feminism, but also other sort of courses. Most recently around the question of Palestine. There are actually a lot of Chinese international students who have been hugely supportive of Palestinians. So I think we want to connect those stories, not because there are interesting histories, but we want to say there are things that we can do here in the U.S. that people we can build solidarity with. We don't have to think. Sometimes it's hard to meet and talk with people directly in China, but there are also a lot of interesting political development among Chinese international students, among the Chinese diaspora in the U.S. that I think is going to have a play an important role in thinking about, not only how to counter U.S.-China inter-imperial rivalry, but also what a progressive future looks like.
So I want to, I guess, pose a question to all three of you. You all challenge some of the prevailing ideas on the left today about how to understand the rivalry between the US and China. And you've spoken today about some of the dominant trends, like including failing to support the uprising in Hong Kong or to recognize the oppression of the Uyghur population. So what is your alternative to, these dominant trends on the left that are impeding an actual understanding of the dynamics? And maybe we'll start with Eli. You haven't spoken in a while.
Sure. So the first thing is to come back to a point I made at the outset, which is to say, once we understand that China and the United States are both part of the same capitalist system that leads to exploitation and oppression worldwide, we understand that there is at least a potential material basis for this kind of solidaristic action, rather than just expressions of sympathy or support or things like that. So we think that there is a kind of structural basis for this. Now, we also have to be extremely realistic about how hard this is right now. Kevin and Rosa and I have spent many years trying to figure this out, going back and forth between China and the United States. We have at different points in the past been deeply embedded in movement communities that existed in China, have organized exchanges between activists in China and the United States and other places internationally. Given how politically repressive things have become under Xi Jinping, it is basically impossible to do that now. Even basic communication with people in China can be challenging. The kinds of apps like Signal that Palestinian solidarity activists have become familiar with recently, we've been using those for a long time, but it makes it very hard to have those kinds of substantive interactions. And we're just not in a place where the kinds of solidaristic action that labor activists like myself imagine, with people going on strike against the same company at the same time in different countries to force their demands, like that is just not remotely possible now given the political situation. So I do think that we have to acknowledge that. Now, what does that mean? There's a couple of different kinds of responses, and my co-authors can weigh in on this as well. The first, which is not very satisfactory, but we talk about this kind of like demonstrating solidarity, or kind of like a unilateral solidarity, even if we understand that there's not going to be the kind of immediate kind of response from our comrades in China. And that's because they just can't do that. If you are, let's say you are a worker at the Tesla factory in Shanghai, and they're trying to organize at the Tesla factory in California, if you went out and protested and say, we stand in solidarity with our comrades in California, you would probably be put in jail, right? So you can't do that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do that, because Chinese people can observe things that are happening in other countries. There's a lot of control of information, but it is not perfect. And it is really important, particularly for the activists and the radicals in China who no longer have a lot of space to speak openly, for them to be able to look at places like the United States and to see voices other than just the xenophobes, the U.S. imperialists who are doing everything they can to contain China. It's important for them to see that, yes, there are allies who understand that our struggles are connected, right? And with the hopes that at some point in the future, there will be more space for that kind of more substantive interaction. Other things that we can do certainly involve organizing. This connects to your last question, involves organizing among the Chinese diaspora communities that are here in the United States. The United States, of course, has a very large Chinese population. There's a lot of community organizations that exist. I'm a professor at a university. Chinese students represent far and away the largest international student segment. There's still more than 300,000 Chinese students in this country. It's come down a little bit in the last few years. As Kevin mentioned, there have been a number of Chinese students in different campuses that have been involved in Palestine solidarity activism, which has been very inspiring. There's been a lot who have been involved in grad student organizing. And so connecting with those communities even if you're working on Palestine solidarity, or even if you're working on graduate student organizing, that builds the bonds of trust and it builds sort of mutual understanding about the different kinds of struggles that we face in the United States, in China, which can allow us to overcome these false divisions that are set up, I think, both by kind of the imperialists on both sides of the Pacific, as well, frankly, as by some leftists who sort of say, no, what's happening in China is incommensurable with what's happening in the United States. No, by connecting with some of these diaspora communities, we can see that that's not the case, and it can help us establish some sorts of networks that can be mobilized in the future. We've been kind of dancing around the Taiwan question quite a bit. But Taiwan is a completely different situation, as I've mentioned, because of its de facto sovereignty. It has its own government. And I do think it's very important for us to be able to build connections with left movements, left communities that exist in Taiwan. And because it has its own government, we are still able to do that. I mean, I've gone back and forth to Taiwan a lot in recent years. And that is an issue which is distinct from China and doesn't get at many of the class issues or issues internal to the PRC that we've been discussing. But for people who are concerned with the US-China conflict, that is a really important, I think, point of entry as well.
Kevin, do you want to chime in?
Okay, very, very briefly. I think I agree entirely with what Eli was saying. I think in terms of the solidarity question or what can be done, I think it depends on a lot of things. But certainly we know there are moments in the past and in the present where we can do more, and there are moments where we cannot do a lot. We always adapt. So that question is never what we can do, period. It's like what we can do in this particular moment, what's helpful. And sometimes we don't have the answers either, but to the extent we can, we try to engage with activists in China, but also in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, elsewhere, etc. But I think, visibility matters, by which I mean to be able to present alternative perspective on US-China rivalry, a progressive critique and vision is important. Sometimes it can, this kind of geopolitical tensions can feel very overwhelming. As individuals, there's really not a lot we can do that seem to change anything. And I think we need to be realistic about our social weight, which is not a huge amount by ourselves. Only by working with other social groups and organizations, people can we make potential changes. But I think visibility matters, and that's why we actually read the book. One of the reasons why I read the book is to present those views. We have welcome debate discussions, and again, we don't have all the answers. Like Eli was saying, there are difficult questions that we have to work through, and I think there are legitimate debate about China that need to happen. But I think it's important to debate it out rather than kind of slip it under the rug and pretend nothing's happening.
Yeah, I'll only add to what Eli and Kevin say, and I, of course, agree with everything they said, is I think for people in the U.S., one of the most important acts of international solidarity is opposing the U.S. government in particular, because that is our biggest, enemy. The main enemy is at home, as Karl Liebknecht, the German revolutionary, famously said. And that's very important to underscore right now, because if you look at the Biden administration's strategy, it is trying to get not only the capitalist class on board with competition and conflict with China, but also the working class and oppressed people by touting the U.S. as engaged in a conflict between democratic powers and autocratic powers. And I think one of the most positive developments is, as a result of the Gaza solidarity movement, is people ripping the mask off of U.S. imperialism and exposing the real nature of the U.S. capitalist state, both in terms of its domestic policy, which is highly autocratic when you look at the behavior of police and you look at the treatment of Palestine solidarity protesters on campus after campus across the United States, and its history of predatory imperialism abroad. We have to remind people about Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, and the history all the way back to the 19th century of the Philippines. That is, that the U.S. is one of the biggest is the biggest imperialist power, and therefore one of the biggest enemies of the peoples of the world, including workers and oppressed people here in the United States. So one of the things we have to underscore is that. And the second thing we have to argue, I think, is you can't point to another capitalist state and say it's an alternative. Certainly the imperialist powers that are rising, like China or Russia or the middling, sub-imperialist powers like Iran or whatever, they're all capitalist states and they all exploit and oppress their own populations. And so we shouldn't correct the problem of US imperialism by searching for illusory alternatives in the existing state order. They're all part of global capitalism, and we have to begin to develop a politics based on the acts of concrete solidarity that Eli and Kevin were talking about, to build a politics of international solidarity from below against all the imperialist powers and in solidarity with all struggles for national self-determination and popular liberation, regardless of which state they occur in, from the United States to anywhere in the Middle East, in Syria or in Iran, to the struggle that was in Hong Kong and the Uyghurs' struggle for self-determination. We should be in solidarity with all of them without exception all around the world. And that's a politics that's really revitalizing the hope for a hot kind of international socialist future.
Thank you. So I'm going to, looking at the audience questions, you've all mentioned Palestine solidarity a bit. So based off of one of the questions, could you talk about how the US-China rivalry shows up in terms of the Israeli genocide in Gaza? Is it impacting the US-China rivalry? Or are there other aspects coming to light in that sense?
So I could say something about it. The first thing to note is that China is not responsible for the genocide, right? Bears no responsibility. The United States bears responsibility. Well, first and foremost, Israel, and secondary, the United States, and followed closely by other European powers. So there's no question about that. The idea, though, that China is interested in the liberation of Palestine is also extremely problematic, right? And so I think we need to be careful about how we approach this question. And there's a few things to understand. The first thing is that China is Israel's second biggest trading partner after the United States, and actually not too far behind. There's been extensive cooperation in many of Israel's strong points, including agriculture, including technology, and including military gear, right? So when the United States, after 1989 and Tiananmen Square, was saying, we can't sell military equipment to China, Israel kept selling military equipment. So Israel was kind of a backdoor, and they've had a lot of cooperation in that respect. Chinese state-owned companies operate the port of Haifa, and they are leading a big expansion of the port in Ashdod, which is just to the north of Gaza. They're building an expansion of the Tel Aviv light rail system. So Chinese state capital is heavily invested in the literal infrastructure of genocide. If tomorrow the Chinese company said, we're going to shut down the port of Haifa and we're not going to allow any weapons or materials to come in to support the genocide, that would have an enormous impact on the development of things in Gaza, and they're not doing that, right? And so I think it's important to note that, because there's not a genuinely kind of solidaristic interest in the liberation of Palestine. What China wants, and this is to come back to the point of it being a capitalist power, China wants economic influence in the region. They want the system to continue to function smoothly. Israel is the richest and most developed country in that region, and so they want Israel to be able to continue to persist more or less as it is. Now, they also want an end to the occupation. China's official stated position on Israel is a two-state solution, which some people think is good. Some people hope for something more liberatory, but they're not going to do anything to fundamentally disrupt that. And I think that you can see in the very cautious way that they've engaged, they don't want to get pulled into the diplomacy. They don't want to have a stake in it, because they understand that this is a bad situation, and the United States is the one that's taking the flak. And you can see, and there's data now coming out that shows that, not surprisingly, America's position in the Middle East has been badly hurt by its unqualified support for the genocide, and China's relative position among many countries in the Middle East and other Muslim countries has improved as a result. So I do think that there's some potential geopolitical upsides. Whether or not this means actual upsides for the Palestinian people, I think is another question.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. I'm agreeing with what Eli laid out. I think there's no doubt. I mean, the key thing to remember is the competition between the U.S. as the main hegemon and China as a rising rival plays out in every theater of the world, including in the Middle East. And if you look at what U.S. imperialism's project has been, in the Middle East for 3 decades, has been to normalize relations between the Arab states and Israel under U.S. hegemony so that the U.S. can control the spigot of oil, which supplies energy first and foremost to whom? China. So the whoever controls the Middle East has a big bully pulpit to dominate world capitalism. And the normalization process obviously excludes and oppresses Palestinian rights, locks them in as occupied people in the West Bank and under siege in the Gaza Strip and now under genocidal war. And that's what has continued to stoke Palestinian resistance against the Middle East being normalized under U.S. imperialism. China has taken advantage, no doubt, by the discrediting of the U.S. by its support for genocide among the vast majority of the peoples of the Middle East throughout the region, whether they're in Iran or in the Arab countries. The U.S. has lost all sorts of credibility. There was just a long article that came out in Foreign Affairs that documented the opinion shift away from the U.S. towards more sympathy with China. And no doubt China will take advantage of that. One thing we should remember is not only does it have these investments in Israel and trade relations with all the Arab regimes, it also has been part of the normalization process, especially between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which it brokered all sorts of new initiatives. So it was part of creating the problem that the Palestinian resistance rose up to try and challenge and shatter. So it's part of the problem. It will use the crisis of the U.S. imperialism in the region for its own advantage to make sure that it benefits economically and it can have untrammeled access to the oil reserves of the region.
Thanks. That's very helpful. And as someone in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, I do see some confusion over the role of China. So that was very clarifying. So a couple other questions, audience questions are, how should we think about recent strides taken by China in relationship to green development? There has been enormous investment in green energy infrastructure, and it looks like they may actually be on track to become carbon neutral more quickly than many Western countries. What's at work here? And then I'll pose a really quick other question, I think, to Eli. If you use the criteria you put forward of commodity production, sale of labor power, etc., when was China actually socialist?
I can take the green technology question. I think it's definitely, for many years, it was encouraging to see the Chinese government-sponsored investment in green technologies, in renewable energies. I think China was leading or was becoming a leading producer of green technologies. And that does have a huge impact in terms of reducing potentially reducing greenhouse emissions. But there is also that continuing capitalist logic at play, where if China's is to continue growing at a kind of acceptable rate of GDP growth a year, which is quite important for obviously for capitalism to function, but also for the Chinese government to sustain its legitimacy, had to keep a certain level of economic development. And one consequence of that is you have to consume a huge amount of energy. And I think there is obviously a tendency to reduce emission. And I think, as I said before, the Chinese government never denied the impact or the seriousness of the climate crisis. But at the same time, I think the capitalist logic at play also means that China continue to consume huge amount of coal and continue to emit huge amount of CO2 gases. One quick example was, I think it's now a couple of years ago, when China was running into a electricity crisis. Again, that helps restart a lot of the coal mines, coal production. Again, I think there are tendencies, on the one hand, serious effort to move into green technology, renewable technologies. At the same time, I think the capitalist logic underlying the Chinese economic system means that it's really extremely hard for the system to move away from coal dependency without, in the short term at least, generating a systematic economic crisis.
Okay, I can deal with the socialism question. Actually, just one thing on the green technology. So I think that China is doing some really commendable things. I think the fact that they've brought down the cost of a lot of these green technologies is good. It is oftentimes also predicated on free labor, particularly by Uyghurs, which is, I think, something that we at least need to consider the ethics of all of that. And straightforward colonial practices of dispossession, particularly there and in southern Mongolia, or Inner Mongolia, as they call it. And I think one other thing is to note is that if it's driven by the logic of commodity production, then there's huge investment that goes into a company like BYD. So it's great to have an electric car rather than a gas car. It's better to not have cars, though, right? And so BYD is the biggest electric car manufacturer in the world. China is far and away the largest auto market in the world. And they completely redesigned their cities to get rid of all the bicycles and to push people into cars. They also have, better public transportation than American cities. But producing an electric vehicle is still a very carbon intensive kind of a project. And they're doing it because they can make a lot of money. So, a socialist approach, I think, to a green transition would look a little bit different than having a company that can beat Tesla on the global market. So anyway, very brief. The question on socialism, we don't actually get into the question in this book of whether China was ever socialist. It's continues to be a thorny issue, I think, for leftists. So I'm not representing my co-authors in the following comments. My view on this is that China was meaningfully socialist for some period of time. But saying it was meaningfully socialist does also not mean that I think it was great or that I'm even interested in really defending it, although I do think that there were some important strides that were made. So using the criteria that I was using, I think by the end of the 1950s and through the 1960s and 1970s, you can very clearly make the case that China was socialist. China was divided into urban and rural society, which was enforced through this thing called the household registration system, or the hukou. If you're in an urban area, that means that you're going to be working in some kind of urban enterprise or civil service, and you have what's called the iron rice bowl, which means that basically you cannot be fired, right? So China basically eliminates the labor market. There is no labor market, right? There are ways that jobs are distributed, but it's not according to the market logic whatsoever. When you have one of those jobs, it means you do have guaranteed access to housing, to healthcare, to education for your children. Now, it might not have been great quality of those various sorts of things, but you have that, and it's independent of the exchange of your labor power for a wage. In rural areas, people are organized into rural collectives. It's not called the iron rice bowl, but you work in exchange for getting these things called work points. And again, access to the basic social services such as they exist is guaranteed by dint of the fact that you are in this collective, that your family is part of it. You might not have access to great healthcare, right? Again, China is a very poor country, but to the extent that healthcare exists, it is not being exchanged according to kind of market principles. It's because you're a member of the collective that gives you access to that. And undoing the rural collectives as well as the state-owned enterprise system was a huge and hugely traumatic event that began in the end of the 1970s in rural areas, and really not until the 1990s in urban areas.
All right. I'll pose two last audience questions, and then feel free to tackle one or both of them, and also maybe give your final thoughts. You've touched on them a little bit. So how has inter-imperialist conflict impacted the global working class beyond China and the US? I'm asking this question with the One Belt, One Road initiative in mind. And then how different would Trump 2.0, so a second Trump presidency, and Biden's current China policies be? Do you want to start with Kevin, then Ashley, and then Eli?
Yeah, I can start. Also, just very quickly to say, I think the fact that people still sort of think about China in terms of socialism, for the left, global left, starting in the 1670s, China, among a few other countries, were kind of inspiration. So leftists during those times looked to China, especially during the Cultural Revolution period, as a living kind of example of socialism. Whatever we think of those periods, I think by now we shouldn't have any illusion about what China is today. And I think thinking, sometimes it's actually liberating to not have any illusions about maybe there is still some socialism in China. There isn't. But I think in terms of the questions about global working class, I think Eli maybe can answer more about the BRI question. I want to mention, I've been sort of traveling a little bit over the last year to places like Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and Taiwan. And, the question of China and U.S.-China rivalry came up a lot in my conversation with like labor activists and just activists in general in those countries. And there's a lot of debate. It depends on kind of where you are. In places like Korea, South Korea, and Japan, where there's a left-wing tradition of anti-militarism, anti-imperialism. There is a sharp critique of U.S. imperialism, but there's also a certain wariness of the impact of rising China in terms of its sort of geopolitical implication. Same with Taiwan. Taiwan is a little bit complicated because I think for a lot of people in Taiwan, they feel the potential threat of a Chinese invasion. So the left there is kind of caught in a very difficult kind of place. And then you have the Philippines, where the labor movement and the left there is, on the one hand, very much opposed to U.S. imperialism because of the history of U.S. imperialism in the Philippines. But also, it's currently in territorial dispute with China in either you call it South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea. So it's quite difficult political question, and I think I certainly don't have answers, or at least not one answer to those questions. But I do think the question of China, U.S.-China inter-imperial rivalry is not just a question between U.S. and China. It does impact, and it has ramifications beyond U.S. and China in the region where we talk about Europe and other places, the Middle East, but certainly in the Asia Pacific region. And I think that we should be, going forward in discussions about this, we should incorporate the voices of other social movements in the regions outside of U.S. and China. I think their voices should be listened to as well.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I'll flag for a debate that Eli and I can have later about the character of Mao's China, which I think was a form of state capitalism. But that is a historical debate where we agree on the contemporary period, which is far more important at this point. But I think it matters for the definition of socialism, which for me is workers' democracy. And if you don't have that, you don't really have socialism. So I think it's calling an apple an orange. But Eli and I and the rest of the people on the left will debate this out till the cows come home. It's a bit of a historical oddity, but I do think it matters. On BRI and then Trump 2.0, on the Belt and Road Initiative and what it's doing to the global working class. Number one, I think what you have to understand is why Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative. In many ways, this is a solution to an internal crisis of Chinese capitalism, in which there was surplus capital, overcapacity, and a need for investment sites globally, and also the need for raw materials, resources to fuel the Chinese economy and its ascent up the value chain. So China launched this for very capitalist reasons. It's not a beneficent project, even though the infrastructure construction, which it often comes with, does benefit certain parts of the civilian population. It is driven by deeper capitalist motives. We should also understand that this comes with loans from Chinese banks. That is, the countries that are getting Belt and Road development take out loans. They're required to hire Chinese workers often and use Chinese companies in the construction of the infrastructure, which in some ways pushes back the development of indigenous industry and development in the countries that benefit from Belt and Road. Most of it is extractivist in nature, as I said earlier, that it's the extraction of key resources that then get shipped back to the Chinese economy to produce commodities that are then exported back to these countries often. And that often reduces the countries that get the Belt and Road investments to resource exports, and they buy then commodities that come back from China in a classic imperialist pattern. And that has led in some countries to deindustrialization. So like in Brazil, lots of Brazil has become deindustrialized, both because of the dynamics with the Chinese economy and that the fact that China has got such an efficient production system that Brazilian capital can't compete in industry. So really it's part of a capitalist project that has geopolitical significance. And it is part of the kind of global race to the bottom that puts wage pressure on workers all around the world as companies try and extract the most profit as possible from workers, and that has a global impact. Final thing about Trump 2.0. Well, there's a blueprint for Trump 2.0. It's called Project 2025, and a bunch of right-wing think tanks came up with it, and you can look at what the brains behind Trump actually look like. But there's a big gap between the brains behind Trump and Trump. And so it's hard to predict what Trump will actually do. What he has put forward is huge tax cuts for the rich, predictably, more domestic deregulation, but massive increases in tariffs, in particular against China. So, and not only against China, but all capitalist states around the world. So he is projecting a much more nationalist economic policy. Whether he does that or not, who knows? But what is underlying both if you go from Obama through Trump to Biden, is the U.S. imperialism at its capitalist and state bureaucratic level are in conflict, competition, and rivalry with China. And that's going to shape the behavior of even somebody as erratic and unpredictable as Donald Trump. So there'll be continuity even as the political figure at the top of the state may change. There'll be continuity and intensifying this rivalry because it's so deeply rooted in global capitalism and the conflict between the U.S. and China over the dominance in it.
Okay, I'll keep it as brief as possible since I know we're about at time. The question on what does Chinese capital mean for the world's working class? A hugely complicated problem because it's all over the world in lots of different industries. I would just point to many of the instances where the expansion of Chinese capital is actually inextricably linked to the expansion of other kinds of capital. And sometimes there's almost a kind of Orientalism associated with how people approach Chinese capital, where they think it's got some like fundamentally different qualities than Japanese capital or American capital or French capital. It's doing the same kinds of things, and it is also frequently incorporated into the very same global supply chain. So we see all of this de-risking effort that Ashley has just been talking about, where people are there are real tariffs on goods exported from China, or they're anticipating them. Well, one of the consequences of this is that a lot of production has been moving to places like Mexico, to Vietnam, to India to produce goods for the United States. but a lot of the companies that are incorporated into those global supply chains are Chinese, right? So if you look at Apple's reorganization of its supply chain, they want to be able to produce 25% of iPhones by the end of next year, which is a huge shift. Basically, all iPhones were produced in China. So they're encouraging all of their suppliers, many of which are Taiwanese. The biggest and most famous ones are Taiwanese, but many of them are also Chinese, right? So they're relocating to India. To the Indian working class, does it matter if they're being exploited by a Taiwanese capitalist, an American capitalist, or a Chinese capitalist? No, it doesn't. They're incorporated into the same supply chain. The rates of exploitation are going to be relatively similar. And therefore, I think that the interests of the Indian workers are going to be the same as the interests of the Chinese workers, who are now facing deindustrialization as all of these supply chains are relocating to these other sorts of places. So, when it comes to dealing with the question of Chinese capital, I don't want to diminish the significance of it, because I think that there are some important kind of peculiar dynamics to it. But I think that from the perspective of workers, this is not a fundamental difference, right? Whether it's a Chinese capitalist or someone else. There is a lot more Chinese capital now than there was 30 years ago. And so I think that is significant. And the way that that interacts with different kinds of states might be significant. But for a lot of workers, it's basically immaterial.
Well, thank you all. This has been a really rich and helpful and clarifying discussion. And thanks also to Rosa Liu, the other co-author who couldn't be here today. And of course to Haymarket, everyone at Haymarket for making this happen. So go buy China and Global Capitalism and discuss more later. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.